My name is Nadia Akefer. I'm 38, and I have spent the last 11 years building a catering business from a single rented kitchen and a van that smelled like cardamom no matter how many times I cleaned it. The business I had to defend wasn't a building. It wasn't a property deed in a leather folder. It was a recipe. It was my grandmother's jollof rice, the one she taught me in her kitchen in Lagos when I was 9 years old. The one I had written out by hand on index cards and locked in my filing cabinet for 6 years. The one I had turned into the signature dish that put Nadia's table on the map in Chicago. The day I found out someone had taken it, I was standing in a hotel banquet kitchen in the West Loop at 6:14 in the morning, and I saw it on a printed menu card sitting on a silver tray. The dish was renamed, the description had been changed by 3 words. But the ingredients, the proportions, the technique, the exact sequence of steps that my grandmother had whispered to me across a gas flame in 1994, those were mine. And I knew exactly who had taken them. Welcome to the part of the story that doesn't get told at the dinner table. It gets told at 6:14 in the morning in a hotel banquet kitchen, and it sounds like silence. Because that's what you go to when you realize that the person who took something from you is someone you trained yourself. I'll go back to the beginning because it matters. I grew up in Evanston in a house that always smelled like something was cooking. My mother, Adiz, was a nurse who worked nights and weekends and slept in the afternoons on a narrow couch in the living room with a pillow over her face. She cooked in the hours between shifts. Big pots of egusi soup and pepper soup and fried plantains that she stacked on plates and covered with foil, and left on the stove with handwritten notes that said things like Nadia, eat before 7 and do not forget the rice is in the oven and I love you, go to bed. My father was gone by the time I was 5, which is to say he was gone before my memory of him was fixed. What I have of him is a smell, something like cigarettes and motor oil, and a specific quality of departure, which is the way a door sounds when someone closes it without saying goodbye. My grandmother, Mama Chidinma, came to visit every other summer from Lagos. She was 4 feet 11 and wore her jewel tied so high it added another full foot. She called me her American granddaughter in a tone that was half pride and half something I could never quite name, something between sorrow and a dare. She cooked differently from my mother. My mother cooked to feed, Mama Chidinma cooked to remember. She stood at the stove with her eyes half closed and her lips moving like she was reciting something private, and she took her time in a way that made the kitchen feel like a church. The jollof rice was the last thing she taught me before she died in 2001. I was 15. I had already been cooking alongside her for 6 summers, but she saved the jollof for last on purpose. I know that now. At the time I thought it was coincidence. She walked me through it on a Tuesday afternoon in our Evanston kitchen while my mother slept on the couch, and she narrated the whole thing in Igbo with her hand over mine on the wooden spoon, correcting the pressure, the angle, the timing. She told me the tomatoes had to cook down until they stopped smelling like tomatoes and started smelling like something else, and that something else was the thing you were waiting for. She told me the rice had to be washed 3 times, no more, no less. She told me the heat had to drop at the exact right moment or the bottom would catch and the whole thing would taste like regret. She used the word regret in English specifically. She said some things translate and some things don't. She said the word for what happens to overcooked jollof does not have a direct translation, but regret was close enough. She died the following March from a stroke. We went to Lagos for the funeral. I had not been back since. I kept the recipe on index cards. I rewrote them at 16 when the originals got wet in a basement flood. I rewrote them again at 22 when I started cooking professionally and wanted precise measurements instead of the handful of this and the guess of that Mama Chidinma had used. I filed them in a green accordion folder and then eventually, when I opened Nadia's table in 2013, into a locked filing cabinet in my office above the kitchen on Randolph Street. I never posted the recipe online. I never gave it to a vendor. I never printed it in a magazine or shared it in an interview. When food writers asked about the jollof, I said it was a family recipe, and I said it with a particular kind of finality that most people understood to mean that the conversation was over. Nadia's Table started as a catering operation out of a rented commercial kitchen in Pilsen. Me, one part-time assistant named Kofi who was studying hospitality management at DePaul, and the van. The van's name was Margaret, which I realize now is a coincidence that feels like something. The first 2 years were thin. I catered office lunches and birthday parties and a series of community events at a church in Hyde Park that paid me in gratitude and occasional cash, and once in a set of ceramic bowls I still use. The jollof rice was on the menu from the beginning because it was the thing people called me about after every event. Not the suya, not the egusi, not the fried plantains with the honey glaze I had developed on my own. The jollof. A woman named Constance Brewer ate it at a corporate holiday party in 2015 and called me the next morning to book 3 events. She told me it tasted like the first time she had eaten in West Africa, which was in Accra in 1988, which was the first time in her life she had understood what food was supposed to do to a person. I wrote that down. I still have the notebook. By 2017, Nadia's Table had a full staff. I had moved out of the rented Pilsen kitchen and into the Randolph Street space. Kofi was my full-time kitchen manager. I had 2 sous chefs, a prep team of 4, a front-of-house coordinator named Sylvia who handled all client contact and made every difficult conversation sound effortless, and a growing roster of private clients who paid the kind of numbers that meant I could finally think about the business in terms of years instead of months. That is when I hired Imogen. Imogen Vance was 26 when she came to me. She had a culinary degree from Johnson and Wales, 2 years at a French bistro in the Gold Coast that had closed during the pandemic, and a portfolio of catering work she had done on her own. Small events, dinner parties, a pop-up that had gotten a brief mention in a neighborhood newsletter. She was precise and quick and deeply competitive in the way that some cooks are, the way that reads as passion when everything is going well and reads as something else when it stops. She was also the most talented young cook I had ever had in my kitchen. She learned fast in a way that was almost uncomfortable to watch. She absorbed technique the way other people absorbed conversation. She watched you do something once and then she did it better. I trained her personally. That was my choice and my mistake, and those 2 things are the same sentence. I showed her how I ran the kitchen. I showed her the mise en place system I had developed over 11 years. I showed her the client communication style I had built with Sylvia. I let her shadow me at events. I let her into the creative process when we were developing new menus for the following season. I trusted her, which is not the same as knowing her. I learned that distinction in the fall of 2022 when she left to start her own catering company. She gave me 2 weeks' notice on a Thursday in October. She was calm and professional and said all the right things about gratitude and opportunity and not wanting to step on anything. I told her I wished her well. I meant it. People leave. Good people leave too. The kitchen does not belong to the people who cook in it, and I have always known that, and I was not resentful. I gave her a reference letter the following week, and she used it, as far as I know, to build something that grew faster than it should have. Imogen's company was called Vance and Table. I noticed the name. I let it go. She was doing events on the north side, corporate lunches mostly, smaller scale than what I was running. Sylvia mentioned it in passing at our quarterly review in early 2023. I said it was fine. It was fine. Chicago is a big food city and there is room. Then in March of 2023, I got a call from a client named Jerome Whitfield, who was a real estate developer and one of my steadiest accounts. He had booked me for 4 events a year since 2018. He called on a Tuesday afternoon and said, awkwardly, slowly, the way people talk when they are delivering news they would prefer not to deliver, that he was going to go with another vendor for his spring gala. He said it was a budget question. He said it quickly enough that I understood it was not a budget question. I asked who he was going with. There was a pause. Vance and Table, he said. Then he said the jollof was exceptional and he looked forward to working with me in the future. I sat with that for 3 days. I told myself it was competition. I told myself it was the normal churn of the catering industry. I told myself I was being territorial in a way that was not useful or attractive. On the fourth day, I asked Sylvia if she had heard anything specific about Vance and Table's menu. She had. One of her contacts had been at a Vance and Table event the previous month. The signature dish, according to this contact, was a West African jollof rice that had been described in the event program as a family-style heirloom recipe developed over generations. I put the phone down, I went to my filing cabinet, I unlocked it, I took out the green accordion folder. The index cards were exactly where I had left them. Mama Chidinma's handwriting on the first card in Igbo, my handwriting on the revised cards in English. With the measurements and the sequence and the specific notation about the heat drop that she had told me was the critical moment. They were all there, they had not been taken, but they did not need to be taken. I had cooked this recipe in front of Imogen Vance approximately 60 times. I had explained the technique. I had corrected her heat. I had told her about the tomatoes and the 3 washes and the moment you were waiting for. I had handed her my grandmother's knowledge across a gas flame, the same way my grandmother had handed it to me, except that I had done it in a professional kitchen and called it training. I did not call Imogen that day. I did not call her the next day. I am not a person who moves before I understand the full shape of what I am moving toward. I called my attorney instead. Her name was Diana Cho, and she had been my business attorney since 2016. She was 44, small, fast-talking, the kind of lawyer who asked you your question and then asked you 3 questions back that were better than your question. I left a voicemail on a Thursday evening. Diana, it's Nadia. I need 30 minutes, sooner the better. I think someone has taken my grandmother's recipe and built a business around it. I know how that sounds, call me. She called me Friday morning at 7:15. I could hear her making coffee. Walk me through it, she said. I walked her through it. The training, the recipe, the calls, Jerome Whitfield. The heirloom description, the 60 events. She was quiet for 10 seconds. The kind of quiet that means someone is thinking rather than preparing to speak. Then she said, Nadia, before we talk about your legal options, I need you to tell me something. Did you ever give Imogen written access to your recipes? Did she sign a non-disclosure agreement? Did you have a confidentiality clause in her employment contract? I knew the answer before she finished asking. No, no, and no, not specifically. She made a small sound, not a sigh. More like the sound someone makes when they have heard this before. All right, she said. Here's where we are. She walked me through it cleanly. Recipe copyright in the United States is limited. You can copyright the written expression of a recipe, she said, but not the recipe itself. The law treats a list of ingredients as a fact, not a creative work. What you may have, she said, is a trade secret claim, but trade secret protection requires that you've taken reasonable measures to keep the information secret. 60 training sessions in an open kitchen with no NDA, she said, carefully, is not going to meet that standard. I understand, I said. That doesn't mean you have nothing, she said. Tell me about the description on the menu, I told her. Heirloom recipe developed over generations. That, she said, may be a false advertising or unfair business practices issue if she's representing it as her own family heritage and it is not. That depends on what she's saying specifically. Do you have a copy of the menu? Not yet, get me one, I hung up. I sat at my desk in the office above the kitchen on Randolph Street, and I looked at the city through my window, and I thought about Mama Chidinma standing at the stove with her eyes half closed. I thought about the word regret in English. I thought about the things that translate and the things that don't. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering information, not confrontation, not accusation. Information, the same way I approached any difficult kitchen problem. Understand the full inventory before you start cooking. Sylvia found a copy of the Vance and Table Spring menu through her network. The dish was listed as Imogen's grandmother's jollof, a slow-cooked West African heirloom recipe passed down through the Vance family, made with hand-selected plum tomatoes. 3-washed long-grain rice and a proprietary spice blend. 3-washed, I read that twice. Then I put the menu in a folder on my desk. I found 3 client reviews of Vance and Table events online. 2 of them mentioned the jollof specifically. One of them said it tasted exactly like what they had eaten at Nadia's table 2 years earlier, which they meant as a compliment, which meant they had no idea what they were saying. Which is the particular kind of wound that comes with an audience that doesn't know it's a wound. I printed all of it. I printed the reviews. I printed the menu. I printed Jerome Whitfield's email confirming he was switching vendors. I printed my own catering invoices going back to 2013 that showed the jollof on every menu. I printed a photo I had found in my own phone archive from 2017 of Imogen standing beside a pot of jollof in my kitchen with a wooden spoon. The photo I had taken because she had gotten the heat drop right for the first time, and I had been proud of her. I put all of it in a folder, not a leather folder, a plain brown accordion folder, the twin of the one in my filing cabinet. I labeled it with a piece of masking tape and a Sharpie. I wrote one word. Mine. I did not tell Kofi, I did not tell Sylvia. I went home. I made a pot of rice, not jollof, just rice. And I ate it standing at my kitchen counter, and I thought about what I was actually trying to accomplish, and whether the thing I wanted was justice or satisfaction, and whether those were the same thing or different things, and which one was worth fighting for. In the morning I had my answer. I wanted the record to be clear. I wanted someone somewhere to know that Imogen Vance's grandmother did not make this rice. My grandmother made this rice. My grandmother made it in Lagos and in Evanston and in my mother's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon with her hand over mine, and the fact that she was gone did not mean the knowledge was available. I called Diana on a Monday. I have the menu, I said. I have reviews, I have photos, I have 11 years of invoices. She was quiet again. Then, all right, Nadia. I want you to understand our options clearly before we decide on anything. She laid them out. 1. A cease and desist letter asking Imogen to remove the false heritage claim from her marketing. 2. A formal unfair business practices complaint with the Illinois Attorney General's office if the false advertising continued. 3. A direct conversation with Imogen before any of the above, which Diana said might resolve this faster and with less damage to both parties. I asked Diana which she would choose. She said I'd choose the conversation, not because it's soft, because it gives her one chance to do the right thing in private before she does it in public. And if she doesn't take it, you have a much stronger position with witnesses. I had a meeting already scheduled that week, not with Imogen, but with a hotel events director named Robert Akeson at the Meridian West Loop. The Meridian had approached me in January about becoming their preferred catering vendor for a 3-year exclusive contract. It was the largest contract I had ever been offered. It was also, I understood when Diana pointed this out, the exact size and type of contract that Vance and Table was simultaneously pitching for. A mutual contact had told Sylvia this 2 weeks earlier in a phone call that Sylvia had summarized for me in a single sentence. Imogen is going after the Meridian. So I drove to the Meridian on Wednesday morning at 6:00 a.m. for a production walkthrough and tasting that Robert Akeson had arranged. I was supposed to be showcasing 3 dishes. The jollof was one of them. I pulled into the service entrance at 6:10. I checked in with the kitchen steward. I set up my station. I was assembling the Messi en place for the tasting when Robert Akeson came through the kitchen door holding a printed menu card and said, apologetically, that there was something he wanted to raise before they got started. He set the menu card on the counter in front of me. It was the Vance and Table catering menu. He had been meeting with Imogen the previous week, he explained. He wanted to show me something before the tasting. He pointed to item 6 on the menu, Imogen's grandmother's jollof, 3-washed long grain rice. He pointed to item 6 on my menu, which he had printed from a previous event, Nadia's Table signature jollof. He looked at me, he didn't say anything. He was a careful man who understood that he was standing at the edge of something he did not fully understand, and he wanted to let me explain it before he drew his own conclusions. That's when I saw the full picture, not just the recipe, the full picture. Imogen had been pitching the Meridian with a menu that included my recipe, my grandmother's recipe, described as her own family heritage, to the exact client I was pitching at the exact same time. knowing that I would be here today because she had worked for me long enough to know my schedule and my clients and my strategy. This was not carelessness. This was a plan. I looked at Robert Akeson. I said the recipe is mine. And then I told him where it came from. I told him about Mama Chidinma. I told him about Evanston. I told him about the Tuesday afternoon in my mother's kitchen and the hand over mine on the wooden spoon, and the word regret in English and the things that translate and the things that don't. I told him about the 3 washes and the heat drop and the 60 training sessions. I told him about the folder on my desk with the masking tape label. He listened. He did not interrupt. He was a tall man with a gray beard who had been in the hospitality business for 30 years, and he had the quality that the best hospitality people have, which is that he made you feel that what you were saying was the only thing happening in the world at that moment. When I finished, he said, "Can you document this?" Yes, he nodded. He said, "I'm going to need 24 hours. There are people here who will want to understand the full situation before we make any vendor decisions." I understand. He said, "Cook the jollof. Let's proceed with the tasting." So I cooked it. I stood in the Meridian's banquet kitchen and I cooked my grandmother's jollof rice with my hands and my memory, and the 11 years of muscle memory I had built in my own kitchen on Randolph Street. The tomatoes went in first. I let them cook down until they stopped smelling like tomatoes and started smelling like something else. The rice was washed 3 times. The heat dropped at the exact right moment. The steam came up and smelled like a Tuesday afternoon in 1994 in Evanston, Illinois, which also smelled like something in Lagos I have never seen but can apparently remember anyway. Robert Akeson tasted it at 7:45 in the morning without bread or accompaniment. He held the spoon still for a moment before he put it in his mouth. He set the spoon down. He said simply, "That's the one." I drove back to Randolph Street. I called Diana from the parking lot. She listened. She said, "All right, I'm sending a cease and desist to Imogen today. Certified mail and email. I want a paper trail that timestamps this before the Meridian makes any announcement." I said, "Diana, I also want to call her." She paused. "Why?" "Same reason you told me to consider it last week. I want to give her one chance in private." She was quiet. Then, "All right, document the call. Turn on call recording if your state law allows it, which in Illinois it does with one-party consent. If she says anything that acknowledges the recipe is yours, that's useful." I hung up. I went upstairs to my office. I sat down. I looked at the green accordion folder in the filing cabinet, its drawer still slightly open from when I had been inside it 2 weeks ago. I looked at the photo on my desk. The one of my mother in her nurse's uniform standing in our Evanston kitchen in 1995 with a pot on the stove behind her. I looked at the wooden spoon hanging on the wall above my desk, the one that had been Mama Chidinma's. The one she had left in our kitchen after the summer of 1999, and that I had taken with me to every apartment and finally to this office on Randolph Street. I called Imogen. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was bright and professional in the way of someone who answers the phone expecting a client. "Vance and Table, this is Imogen, it's Nadia." There was a pause, a half-second, maybe less, long enough. "Hi," she said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, just enough. "I'm going to say something," I said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." She said nothing. I took that as agreement. I said, "I know you've been using my grandmother's jollof recipe. I know you're describing it as your own family's heirloom recipe on your menus and in your marketing. I know you're pitching the Meridian West Loop. And I know you know all of this, so I'm not going to spend time on the question of whether it happened. I'm calling to tell you that my attorney is sending a cease and desist letter today. She's asking you to remove the false heritage claim from all your marketing materials within 48 hours. I'm calling before the letter arrives because you worked for me for 4 years, and I thought you deserved to hear this from me first." The silence that followed was the longest I have ever maintained on a phone call while waiting for another person to speak. Finally, she said, "Nadia, the recipes aren't proprietary. Techniques aren't copyrightable, you know that." "I know the law," I said. What I'm asking you to stop doing is claiming that my grandmother's recipe is your grandmother's recipe. That's the specific thing the letter addresses. Another pause. It's a West African jollof rice. It's a regional dish. There are thousands of versions, not with 3 washes, I said. Not with the heat drop at that specific moment. Not described in those specific words. Not by a woman whose grandmother did not cook West African food. Her breath changed. Not much, just slightly. Nadia, I learned this recipe in your kitchen. You learned my grandmother's recipe in my kitchen. That's accurate. What you did not do is inherit it. This is going to get messy, she said. Yes, I said. It will get less messy if you take the heritage claim off your menus in the next 48 hours. That's the request. After that, it's in Diana's hands. I hung up. I sat for 30 seconds with my hands flat on the desk. Then I started making notes. Diana sent the letter that afternoon. I received confirmation that it had been opened by email at 4:47 p.m. Imogen did not respond that day. She did not respond the following morning. At noon on Thursday, I received a response from an attorney I had not heard of before, a man named Carter Phillips who wrote in the careful, padded language of someone who has been asked to buy time. The letter said that Ms. Vance valued her relationship with the broader culinary community and was committed to working toward a resolution and would need 14 business days to review the cease and desist and prepare a formal response. Diana read it in 6 seconds and called me. That's a stall, she said, which means she's not sure she can win this. I'm going to accelerate the timeline. Diana filed an unfair business practices complaint with the Illinois Attorney General the following Monday. She simultaneously sent a letter to Robert Aikson and the Meridian's legal team documenting the situation and providing copies of my invoices going back to 2013, the photos, the event programs, the client reviews that had noted the similarity of the dishes, and the menu comparison showing the 3-washed language. She did not tell me she was sending the Meridian letter until after she had sent it. She said she wanted it to arrive before I had a chance to second-guess it. Robert Aikson called me Tuesday morning. He had been in this business, he said, long enough to understand when a dispute had a clear answer and when it didn't. He said this one had a clear answer. He said the Meridian had made a decision. I asked him to tell me what it was. He said he'd rather do it in person. I drove to the Meridian on a Tuesday at noon. I wore the same blazer I had worn the week before, not for any symbolic reason. It was the blazer I wore when I meant business, and I had not yet assigned a different one to this occasion. Robert Aikson met me in the lobby. He walked me to a conference room. There was a woman from the Meridian's legal team and a man who was the hotel's director of events. They had printed documents on the table. One of them was a contract. They offered me the 3-year exclusive vendor contract. They had declined to proceed with Vance and Table. The events director explained, carefully, that the Meridian held its vendor relationships to a standard of authenticity and transparency, and that the documentation Diana had provided had been sufficient for them to make a clear decision. He said the word authenticity with a particular emphasis that meant something. Robert Aikson added quietly that the jollof had been exceptional. I signed the contract. The pen was a hotel pen, the kind that hotels keep in conference rooms. And it worked fine, and I did not think about the symbolism until later when I was driving home, and I thought about my grandmother's hand over mine on the wooden spoon in Evanston, and I thought about the specific weight of a signature and what it means and what it protects. I called my mother that afternoon. My mother was 69 and lived in a smaller house in Evanston 2 miles from the one we had grown up in. She had retired from nursing the year before and spent most of her time gardening and attending a book club that she described as insufficiently serious and watching Nigerian television dramas that she described as exactly serious enough. I told her the whole story. I did not tell it quickly. I told it the way she had taught me to tell important things. Start at the beginning and don't skip the parts that make you look bad. Because the parts that make you look bad are usually the parts that explain the most. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said in Igbo, which she used when she meant something particularly precisely, "Your grandmother knew." "What did she know?" I said. "She said your grandmother knew that the things she gave you were not just food. She knew they were going to need a lock." I said I wished she had known sooner. "My mother said she knew at the right time. You're 38, you're holding it." I sat with that for the rest of the drive. The cease and desist ultimately worked, not in 48 hours. In 11 days, which was the Tuesday before Carter Phillips's 14 business day deadline. I suspect Robert Aikeson's decision had something to do with that, though Diana said she could not prove it and did not want to speculate in writing. Imogen's website was updated. The menu language was changed. Imogen's grandmother's jollof became West African jollof rice in the Vance and table style. The three-washed language disappeared. The heirloom description disappeared. I screenshotted the old version. I had it already, but I screenshotted the new version too. I saved both to a folder on my phone. The folder was labeled with a date, not a word. Sometimes dates are more precise than words. There was one more thing that happened, and it happened the way the things that matter most often happen, quietly and out of order, and after you have already decided the story was finished. 3 weeks after the cease and desist compliance, I received a message on Instagram from a woman named Adjora Equium who said she had eaten at a Vance and table event in Wilmette in January, and that the jollof had reminded her of something she had eaten in Enugu at a wedding in 1992, and that she had been trying to find it for 30 years. She had found me through a Google search after someone at the event had mentioned Nadia's table in passing. She asked if I was accepting catering inquiries. I wrote back. I told her yes, and I told her that the recipe had come from my grandmother, who was originally from Anambra State, which is not far from Enugu, and that it was possible what she had eaten in 1992 and what she was trying to find belonged to the same tradition. She wrote back within 3 minutes. She said she had been thinking it was lost. I told her it was not lost, I had it. She booked a private dinner for 14 people. She asked if we could make a note in the menu about where the recipe came from. I said we could. I told Sylvia the description I wanted. She wrote it up and I approved it. It said Nadia's grandmother's jollof, a family recipe from Anambra State, passed down by Chidinma Okafor through her granddaughter Nadia. I read that menu card the morning of the event in my kitchen on Randolph Street. I had not printed it. Sylvia had printed it. But I held it and read it and felt the specific weight of a name in print, my grandmother's name, Chidinma Okafor, in a font I had chosen for the menus when I opened the business 11 years ago, and that I had never thought, specifically, would one day be used for this. I went downstairs. Kofi was already in the kitchen. He looked at me when I came in. He could read my face in the way that people who have worked alongside you for 11 years can read your face without asking any questions. He said, "You all right?" I said yes. He said, "Jollof today." I said, "Jollof today." He went back to his work. I tied on my apron. I stood at the stove. The tomatoes went in first. I let them cook down until they stopped smelling like tomatoes. But I should go back because there are parts of this that I moved through too quickly and they deserve more than a paragraph. The parts about Imogen specifically. Because she was not simply a villain in the way that it is easy to make people villains after they have done something that hurt you. She was a person I had genuinely admired, and the admiration made what she did more confusing, and the confusion made me angrier than the theft did. Which is a strange order for feelings to arrive in, but it was the order they chose. I had hired Imogen because she reminded me of myself at 26. I had not said this to anyone at the time because it sounded like the kind of thing you say when you want to be praised for your self-awareness, but it was true. She was ambitious in the specific way that comes from having been underestimated for a long time. She was precise in the specific way that comes from having grown up in a household where imprecision had consequences. She was hungry in a way that went beyond food, the way that only people who have genuinely not been sure they were going to make it carry hunger in their bodies, as a permanent condition rather than a passing one. I should say that I do not know everything about Imogen Vance's life. I know what she told me during 4 years of working together and what I observed. which is enough to understand someone's professional character and not nearly enough to understand why they make the choices they make when they are under pressure. I have thought about this. I have thought about whether she understood fully what she was taking. I have thought about whether she told herself it was just technique, just training, just the ordinary way that cooks learn from cooks and carry things forward. I have thought about whether she believed her own marketing, whether the recipe had become hers in her own mind through the act of cooking it. The way things can become yours through repetition even when they are not. I do not know the answer to any of those questions. What I know is what the menu card said: 3 washed, heirloom, generations. Those are not words that happen by accident. Diana told me, several weeks after the compliance letter arrived, that Carter Phillips had tried to make an argument about the nature of culinary transmission. Specifically, that professional kitchens are by their nature spaces of knowledge exchange, and that the expectation of exclusivity in that context was unreasonable. Diana had written back, she told me, a response that was 3 paragraphs long and that she described as precise. She did not share the full text with me, but she told me the gist, which was that there is a meaningful difference between learning a technique and appropriating a heritage. And that the specific marketing language Imogen had used was not a description of technique, but a claim of inheritance. And that inheritance has a specific legal and ethical meaning that does not transfer with employment. I appreciated that sentence. I wrote it down. Inheritance has a specific legal and ethical meaning that does not transfer with employment. I have thought about it many times since. I think about it when I think about what Mama Chidinma gave me, which was not information. A technique can be learned from a book. A method can be absorbed in a professional kitchen. What my grandmother gave me was the context, the Tuesday afternoon, the hand over mine. The word regret in Igbo that does not translate directly, but that meant something specific about what happens to a dish when you rush the part that requires patience. She gave me the reason behind the recipe, which is the part that is not transferable and is the part that belongs to whoever receives it across a kitchen fire from someone who loves them. The Meridian contract began in May. The first event was a gala for a nonprofit that worked with immigrant communities on the North Side. It was 300 people and a 6-course menu, and the most complex production I had run since a wedding reception in 2019 that had involved a last-minute dietary emergency and a missing delivery and Kofi. Performing what I can only describe as a culinary improvisation that I still think about when I need to remember that things can be fixed. The Jollof was the 4th course. I had asked Robert Aikeson's team to include it on the menu description with the full attribution. They had agreed without discussion. The menu card at each place setting read, Nadia's Table Signature Jollof, a West African heirloom recipe by Chidinma and Nadia Okafor, Anambra State in Chicago. I stood in the back of the banquet room when the 4th course was served. I watched 300 people receive a bowl of rice that had begun in my grandmother's kitchen in Lagos and passed through an Evanston afternoon and a green accordion folder and a locked filing cabinet and a cease and desist letter and a Tuesday morning at a hotel in the West Loop. I watched a man at table 11 lift the spoon and pause the way people pause when food is doing something to them that they did not expect. I watched a woman across the room close her eyes for a half-second. I watched Kofi come through the kitchen door at the back and nod at me from across the room with the small, precise nod of a man who understands what has been accomplished and does not need to make it into a speech. I went home at midnight. I took my shoes off at the door. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. I thought about the year I had spent being careful about this recipe. Careful not to share it, careful not to print it, careful in a way that my mother had noticed and commented on once when she said, Nadia, you hold that recipe like it's breakable. I had told her it was. She had looked at me with the particular expression she used when I said something that was partly right and partly not, and she had said, the recipe isn't breakable. The recipe is yours. The thing that's breakable is the story of where it came from, and you have to tell that story or it loses its shape. I had not fully understood what she meant until I read the Vance and table menu in Robert Aikeson's kitchen at 6, 14 in the morning. What Imogen had done was not only take the recipe. She had replaced the story. She had put her own grandmother in my grandmother's kitchen. She had put a different name on the Tuesday afternoon in Evanston. That is the specific thing that had made me sit in a parking lot on Randolph Street and start making a folder with a masking tape label. You can recover a recipe. You cannot unreplace a story once it has been told enough times. That was what I was afraid of, not the business, not the Meridian contract. The story, getting small, getting anonymous, getting attributed to a woman who never stood at a stove in Lagos with her eyes half closed and her lips moving like a private recitation. Diana called me the morning after the Meridian Gala. She asked how it had gone. I told her it had gone well. She asked if there was anything else she needed to handle. I said I didn't think so. She said, "Nadia, for what it's worth, you handled this well. You didn't rush it. You got the record straight without making it messier than it needed to be." I said, "I had a good attorney." She said, "You had good paperwork. There's a difference." I laughed. It was a real laugh, the first one in several weeks. She laughed too. She hung up. I went to my filing cabinet. I unlocked the bottom drawer. The green accordion folder was inside. I took out the index cards. Mama Chidinma's handwriting on the first one in Igbo, faded but legible. I had not looked at the original card in 2 years. I looked at it now. Her handwriting was large and forward-leaning, the handwriting of someone confident about the permanence of what she was writing down. I made a decision that morning that I had been making slowly for several weeks without knowing it. I sat down at my desk and I wrote out the recipe in full, not on index cards, on a proper sheet of paper. I wrote Chidinma Okafor's Jollof rice at the top, with the date 1994 beneath it, and the note passed to Nadia Okafor, Evanston, Illinois, Tuesday afternoon, August 16th. I wrote every instruction. The tomatoes, the 3 washes, the heat drop, the moment you were waiting for. I wrote it the way Mama Chidinma had told it to me, partly in technique and partly in something that was not technique, the pauses, the waiting. The particular patience required at each step and why it mattered. I included the word regret in both languages. I noted which parts she had told me in Igbo and which parts she had switched to English for. I had 2 copies made. I laminated one. I put the original in an archival sleeve and placed it in the front of the accordion folder with a paper clip that said original in black marker. The laminated copy I framed. It hangs now in my office on Randolph Street, above the wooden spoon that was Mama Chidinma's. The second copy I mailed to my mother in Evanston with a note that said, "I think she would want you to have this." My mother called me the following Saturday. She did not say anything when I picked up. I could hear her breathing. Then she said in English, "Your grandmother would be very irritated that it took all of this to make you write it down." I said, "I know." She said she also would have approved of the lawyer. I said, "I know, we talked for an hour." She told me about the book club, which had just finished a novel she found too romantic to take seriously. I told her about the Meridian, about the gala, about the man at table 11 who had paused with the spoon. She said that sounded like Anambra DNA. I said, "Maybe it is." She said, "It is." She said it with the certainty she reserved for things that were true rather than things she believed. And in my mother's case, the distinction was audible. Kofi asked me about all of it eventually, which is to say he asked about it in the way Kofi asked about things, sideways and quietly, and only after he had decided the moment was right. We were doing prep on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the gala, and he was breaking down chicken and I was reviewing a menu, and he said without looking up, "You good with how everything went?" I said yes. He said, "Imogen." I said, "I'm good with it." He said, "She was talented." I said, "She was." "That's not the same thing as being right." He nodded. He went back to the chicken. Then he said, "The recipe's still yours." I said, "It always was." He said, "I know, I just wanted to say it out loud." That is one of the things about working with someone for 11 years in a kitchen. They know which things need to be said out loud and which things don't, and they choose correctly. Sylvia reorganized our marketing that fall to include more of the origin story. Not in an overwrought way, not in a way that announced itself as a response to anything, just accurately. The website now says that Nadia's table was founded on West African home cooking traditions, specifically the recipes and techniques passed to Nadia Okafor by her grandmother Chidinma Okafor, originally of Anambra State, Nigeria. The menu for every event with the Jollof includes the attribution. Some clients ask about it. I tell them the Tuesday afternoon story when they do. I tell it the same way every time because the same things happened, and they deserve to be told the same way. Adiora Equium, the woman from Instagram who had been trying to find the taste she had eaten in Enugu in 1992, became a regular client. She booked 3 events in the following year and sent a card at Christmas that she had handwritten in Igbo, which she said she was learning again after 30 years away from it. I had Kofi translate it, which he did with a slight expression of surprise, because Kofi is from Ghana and his Igbo is workable but not precise, and the card was precise. She had written, "Some things return to you, you have to be standing in the right place." I put the card on my desk. I think about it when I think about the thing my mother said about the story losing its shape if you don't tell it. I think Ajora's card is the same idea in a different form. Some things return. The shape holds if someone keeps it. The Meridian contract is now in its 2nd year. We have catered 41 events for them, including a conference for a group of immigrant small business owners last spring that was one of the most satisfying events I have ever run. Not for the size or the complexity, but for the room, which was full of people who understood what it meant to build something from a recipe that did not belong to the city they were in. The jollof was on the menu, the attribution was on the menu. I stood in the back of that room too. The same pause happened at the same moment. It always does, and I do not think it is nostalgia. I think it is recognition, the thing that happens in the body when food tells you something true about where it came from. The wooden spoon is still above my desk. The accordion folder is still in the filing cabinet, though the drawer stays closed now instead of slightly open. The filing cabinet is the same one, the same lock, the same key on my ring alongside the door key and the van key and the Meridian service entrance key that Robert Aikeson's team gave me in May. I have not added a 4th key to the ring. I have thought about whether I should have done things differently, whether I should have asked Imogen to sign something in 2017 when I started training her. Whether I should have written the recipe down in legal language before anything happened. I have thought about this the way you think about the things you would have done differently if you had known. Which is to say unproductively and in the middle of the night and then usually let go of by morning. What I know now is what Mama Chidinma knew in 1999 when she left the wooden spoon in our kitchen, which is that the things you give the people you love need both a vessel and a lock. The vessel is the teaching, the Tuesday afternoon, the hand over mine. The lock is the record, the writing down, the name in a font on a menu card, the lawyer on the phone at 7:15 in the morning who says, "All right, walk me through it." I did not understand why my grandmother gave me the spoon and not the index cards. Now I think I do. The spoon was the vessel. She expected me to make the cards myself. She expected me to be the one who understood that the teaching was only half of it and that the other half was the naming, the document, the signature. She expected me to be standing in the right place when the thing tried to return to someone else. I was 38 when I understood this. She was 9 years gone. The wooden spoon is still above my desk. The recipe is framed beside it. The name at the top says Chidinma Okafor, which is correct, and the name below it says Nadia Okafor, which is also correct, and both of them are in the same building on Randolph Street in Chicago. Which is not Lagos and is not Evanston, and is also both of those things in the way that the things you inherit are always both where they came from and where they ended up. That is my story. 11 years of building, 4 years of training someone who took the wrong lesson, 3 weeks of folders and lawyers and a hotel kitchen and a 6:14 a.m. moment that clarified everything, and then a Tuesday afternoon that I have been carrying since I was 15 finally had a place to land. If this reminded you of something you have not written down yet, go write it down tonight. The name matters, the date matters, the story holds its shape when you tell it. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I will see you next time. There is one more part I have not told, and it is the part that took me the longest to process, which is what happened with Mark. I mean Kofi. I should say that Mark is the name I assigned to my husband in my own head while I was going through all of this, which is not his name. Which is a thing I noticed only when I was recounting the story to my therapist 6 months later, and she asked who Mark was, and I had to explain that Mark was the shorthand I had developed for the person who should have been standing beside me and who was partly absent and partly present, and mostly trying very hard to be in two places at once. My husband is named David, and David is the part of this story I have not told yet. David Ackafer, née David Mensa, took my last name when we married in 2016, which is unusual and which he did without ceremony or announcement. Simply by going to the county clerk's office on a Thursday and filing the paperwork and coming home and telling me over dinner. He said he wanted our family to have one name. He said he wanted the name to be mine. I had cried, which I do not do often or easily, and he had looked alarmed and then relieved when I explained that they were the good kind. He is a structural engineer who works for a firm in the Loop, and who thinks about load-bearing walls and cantilevers and the invisible forces that hold things up with the same kind of deep practical attention that I bring to Massey End Place and stock reduction. He is, in other words, a person who understands infrastructure. David knew about Imogen from the beginning. He knew because I do not keep professional trouble from him, which is a rule we established early in our marriage and that has served us well. He knew about the recipe. He knew about the folder. He knew that I was troubled in September in a way that I was not fully expressing. He knew, specifically, because of a thing he told me later, that I had started rechecking the filing cabinet lock every night before bed in a way that I had not done before. The way people recheck a door when they are afraid of something they have not named yet. What David did not know until I told him in October was the full scope of what Imogen had done and the full scope of what I was planning. I had not kept it from him deliberately. I had kept it from him the way you keep difficult things while you are still figuring out their shape, the way you cannot hand someone a thing that does not have edges yet. When I told him on a Sunday morning over coffee, he listened the way he always listened, which was completely with his full face. With the stillness of someone who has decided that listening is the most important action available and that anything else is wasted motion. When I finished, he said, "Do you need me to do anything?" I said, "I need you to know." He nodded. He refilled my coffee. He sat back down. He said, "Diana's the right call. Don't do anything before she's read all of it." I said, "I know." He said, "Your grandmother would have liked Diana." I stopped. I looked at him. I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "Because Diana is the kind of person who turns up to a fight with the right paperwork and no wasted emotion. That's Chidinma energy." I sat with that for a moment. Then I laughed in the specific way that you laugh when someone says something that is so accurate it is almost physical, the laugh that is also recognition. He smiled. He did not make a whole thing of it. He went back to his coffee and his Sunday newspaper and left me with the thing he had said in the place where it would grow. He came with me to the Meridian signing. I had not asked him to come. He had simply appeared at the door of the office at 11:15 on the Tuesday morning in question, in his work clothes with his messenger bag, and said, "I have a meeting at 1, but I can be there for the signing." "Do you want me there?" I said yes. He nodded. He got in the car. He sat in the conference room at the Meridian. He did not speak during the meeting. He was not there to speak. He was there to witness the way Pastor Henderson sat down slowly in the story I had been told once about a woman who had needed someone to see what was happening rather than intervene in it. David understood the difference. After the signing in the elevator, he said, "That's the contract your grandmother made possible." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then she should be at dinner tonight." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Make the jollof. Tell me the whole story again from the beginning. I'll listen." So that night I made jollof rice in our kitchen at home for the first time in 2 years. Not for a client, not for an event, just for us. I made it in the small pot, the right size for 2 people, and I stood at the stove and I went through every step the way Mama Chidinma had taught me. slowly and with intention, and with the specific quality of attention that she had told me was not optional. The tomatoes went down first. I let them cook until they changed. The rice was washed 3 times. The heat dropped. David sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and watched me cook. He had watched me cook hundreds of times. He watched this time differently, the way he watches load-bearing structures differently from decorative ones, with the understanding that what he was looking at had something invisible holding it up. I told him the whole story, not just the Imogen part, the full story. Mama Chidinma and Lagos and the summer visits and the Evanston kitchen and the Tuesday afternoon and the index cards and the accordion folder and the 6 years of locks and the van named Margaret and the first event and the Pilsen kitchen and Kofi and Sylvia and every version of the recipe as it had moved through my life until it landed in the Meridian's banquet hall on a plate for 300 people with my grandmother's name on the menu card. He listened the whole way through. The rice was done before I finished. I served it. He took a spoon, he held it for a moment. He said, "What's the word your grandmother used for what happens when you rush the part that needs patience?" I told him in Igbo. He said, "What's the English?" I said, "Regret, but that's not exactly it." He said, "What's exactly it?" I thought about it. I said, "It's closer to the feeling of having been warned and not listened. The feeling that the knowledge was available and you moved past it too fast. It's not just regret. It's regret with a specific awareness of the moment you should have slowed down." He nodded. He ate. He said, "That's a better word than regret." I said she thought so. We finished the jollof in the kitchen at home on a Tuesday in October and sat with the empty pot between us. The wooden spoon was not there, it was in my office, but its absence was its own kind of presence. I thought about the chain of Tuesdays, the Tuesday in Evanston in 1994. The Tuesday I found the cease and desist compliance. The Tuesday at the Meridian, this one. Tuesdays, I said out loud. David looked up. I said, "A lot of things have happened on Tuesdays." He looked at the empty pot. He said, "The important ones." I did not go to therapy because of the Imogen situation specifically. I was already in therapy when it happened. I had been seeing a therapist named Dr. Mwangi for about 2 years. A woman in her 50s who had a practice in Hyde Park and who wore the same 3 colors in rotation, and who had a talent for asking the question that was one level deeper than the question you had arrived with. I told her the whole story in segments. First in October when it was still unresolved, and then in December after the Meridian contract was signed, and then in February when I had begun to understand what it had actually been about. In February she asked me something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Nadia, when you say you want the record to be clear, what are you protecting?" I said, "My grandmother's name." She waited. She had the patience of someone who knows that first answers are almost never complete answers. I said, "And the accuracy of the inheritance. The idea that it came from a specific person in a specific place for a specific reason, and that those things matter even when they're inconvenient to explain." She said, "Why are they inconvenient to explain?" I thought about this for a long moment. I said, "Because explaining inheritance means admitting that what you have came from outside yourself. It means the recipe isn't yours in the way that something you invented is yours. It's yours in a different way, a handed way." And that's a harder thing to argue for in a business context because business language prefers origination to transmission. Dr. Mwangi wrote something on her legal pad. She said, "And yet you made the argument." I said, "Yes." She said, "And it held." I said, "Yes." She said, "Then the language of business can accommodate transmission when transmission is documented." I thought about Diana saying inheritance has a specific legal and ethical meaning that does not transfer with employment. I thought about the Meridian menu card with the 2 names on it. I thought about the laminated recipe on my office wall. I said, "Yes, when you make it visible." She nodded. She asked how I felt about Imogen now with some distance. I thought about it honestly. I said, "I feel something that is not quite sympathy and not quite contempt. I feel something closer to disappointment in a specific direction, which is the direction of talent misapplied." She was good. She could have built something that was genuinely hers. She had the skill for it. And instead she built something on a borrowed foundation and convinced herself the borrowing was legitimate because she had been standing in the room when the thing was made. Dr. Mwangi said, "What would you tell her if you were going to tell her something?" I said, "I would tell her the difference between learning at someone's side and inheriting something from them. I would tell her that inheritance requires a specific relationship, a specific love, a specific passage that cannot be replicated by professional proximity. I would tell her that what she took was not the recipe, it was the Tuesday afternoon, and that is not takeable. It stays with the person it was given to." I have not spoken to Imogen since the phone call. I do not know the current status of Vance and Table. Diana monitors it periodically and tells me if anything surfaces that is relevant. Nothing has surfaced. I wish her no harm. I wish her something more complicated than harm and more specific than forgiveness, which is the wish that she builds something that is genuinely hers and that she learns through the building of it. The difference. The locksmith who changed the cabin locks in the story I had been told did one thing with the 3 new keys. One for the owner's ring, one for the husband's jacket pocket, and one in the leather folder. I did one thing with the knowledge that came from my grandmother's hand over mine. I wrote it down, I named it, and I put it on a wall where it could be seen but not borrowed. The recipe is on the wall, the spoon is above it. The name at the top says Chidinma Akefer, the name below says Nadia Akefer. Below that it says Anambra State and Chicago, which is all the geography that matters. Which is both a place in Nigeria that I have never seen and a place in Illinois that I have known since I was old enough to stand at a stove. Some things travel, some things hold. The thing my grandmother gave me was both, which is the rarest and most necessary kind of gift, the kind that moves and the kind that stays. The kind that is yours to keep and yours to carry and yours to name correctly when someone else calls it theirs. That is the whole story. Write yours down, lock the drawer, tell the right people. And if anyone ever uses the word heirloom about something that does not belong to them, make sure you are the one with the paperwork. I want to say something about the kitchen itself because I have not said enough about it and it matters. The kitchen on Randolph Street is not a beautiful kitchen. It is a professional kitchen, which means it is built for function and light and cleanability and the specific choreography of multiple people working in close proximity without collision. The surfaces are stainless steel, the floor is sealed concrete, the hood vents are industrial. The refrigeration units hum at a frequency that becomes inaudible after the first 6 months, and then returns to audibility only when they shut down for cleaning. At which point the silence is strange enough to be noticed. I designed the kitchen myself. I had been an architect's daughter's kind of person before I was a cook. Which is to say that I had grown up around my mother's insistence that the way a space is organized determines what kind of life happens in it. My mother had not been an architect. She had been a nurse who happened to be profoundly particular about domestic arrangement. She had moved the furniture in our Evanston house 3 times before I was 12. Always with a specific rationale about traffic patterns and light, and the positioning of conversation relative to the entrance. She would have made an excellent architect, I think, or an excellent kitchen designer. She made an excellent nurse, which is the version of the same impulse applied to human bodies rather than built spaces. I designed the Randolph Street kitchen with the understanding that the jollof was going to be made in it regularly and at scale. I designed the burner placement with that in mind. The specific burner on which the jollof begins is the back left, which gets the most consistent heat and which has a slightly slower response when you turn it down. Which is actually what you want at the critical moment, the moment of the heat drop, because the delay gives you a fraction of a second more of high heat as the temperature descends. Which is exactly the fraction that the bottom crust needs to form without burning. I have never explained this to a journalist. I am explaining it now because the physical details matter. The recipe is not abstract. It lives in a specific burner in a specific kitchen in a specific city that is also, in some way that I do not fully understand but fully believe, a specific afternoon in Evanston in August 1994. Kofi knows which burner, he does not use it for anything else without asking. this is not a formal rule. It is a kitchen understanding, the kind that develops between people who have worked together long enough that the important things do not need to be stated as policies. He knows which spoon goes to which pot. He knows the heat drop moment by sound, which is the specific change in the sizzle that precedes it. He learned it by watching, which is to say he learned it the same way I learned it, in the kitchen from the person in front of him, which is the only real way it has ever been passed. I have thought about what it means to pass something down in a kitchen versus what it means to pass something down in a family. And I think the answer is that they are the same thing when the kitchen is the family's place of transmission. My grandmother did not separate the food from the love from the instruction. They arrived together, the hand over mine and the wooden spoon and the Igbo word and the specific smell of tomatoes changing into something else. To learn it is to receive all of those things at once, not just the technique. When Kofi learned the heat drop, he learned it from someone who learned it from someone whose hands knew it before her mind could articulate why it mattered. That is not something you can absorb from a recipe card alone. The card is the map. The Tuesday afternoon is the territory. Adora Equium came to the kitchen once, not for an event, but because she asked if she could see where the jollof was made, and I said yes. She stood in the door of the kitchen on a Wednesday morning and looked at the burners and the stainless steel and the wooden spoon on the wall in my office through the open door. She said, "It's exactly right." I said, "What is?" She said, "The way it feels in here, like someone is still cooking even when no one is at the stove." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the kitchens that feel that way and the ones that don't, and what the difference is. I think the difference is whether anything real has happened in the kitchen, whether it has been used for something that mattered beyond the meal. Mama Chidinma's kitchen in Lagos, which I have never visited, must feel that way. Our Evanston kitchen still feels that way, my mother told me last winter, even though she has remodeled it twice and the stove is new and the layout is different. She said she can still smell the thing that changed. I know what she means by that. It is not the tomatoes, it is the something else. The Randolph Street kitchen now has 10 years of that smell layered into it. 10 years of the jollof and the egusi and the pepper soup and the suya and the 100 other dishes I have cooked in it, and the 1,000 events they have been carried to in the van that replaced the original Margaret, which I also named Margaret without pausing to consider whether that was appropriate, because by that point the name belonged to the van the way Randolph Street belonged to the kitchen. Which is to say permanently, and without needing justification. The second Margaret is white with the Nadia's Table logo on the side in the warm terracotta color that my graphic designer had suggested in 2019 when I rebranded. A color that is simultaneously a West African market stall and a Chicago summer evening, which she had achieved by looking at a lot of photographs and then by asking me to describe both of those things without using color words, which I had done, and which had resulted in the color that now drives down Lake Shore Drive 4 or 5 times a week carrying pots of things that began in a kitchen on Randolph Street, and before that in a kitchen in Evanston and before that in Lagos. The logo also includes in very small print at the bottom the words Evanston, 1994. My graphic designer had suggested a founding date, which would have been 2013, the year I opened the business. I had said that was not the founding date. She had asked what the founding date was. I had told her about the Tuesday afternoon. She had said without hesitation, then that's the date. She had put it in. It is small enough that most people do not notice it until they look closely at the van. When they ask about it, I tell them the Tuesday afternoon story. It always takes longer to tell than people expect. That is because they expect the story to be about a business. It is about a kitchen in Evanston and a woman from Anambra State who left a wooden spoon behind and a Tuesday afternoon that has been determining things ever since. I turned 39 in January. David made me dinner, not jollof, something else. A dish he had been working on for months that was his own invention and that had no grandmother behind it and no Tuesday afternoon. Only his own hours in our kitchen and his own careful engineering sensibility applied to the problem of flavor. It was extraordinary, I told him so. He said, I'm still learning. I said, from who? He looked at me. He said, from you. I said, I learned from my grandmother. He said, I know. So did I indirectly. That is how inheritance works. It does not stop at the person who received it directly. It passes on and on through the kitchens and the Tuesday afternoons and the hands over hands on wooden spoons. Through all the people who stood in the right place at the right time and received something they did not know they would spend the rest of their lives carrying and protecting and eventually handing. Forward. The recipe is on the wall, the name is at the top, the lock is on the drawer, the key is on my ring. And somewhere in Anambra State there is a way of cooking rice that traveled to Lagos and then to Evanston and then to Randolph Street and then to the Meridian West Loop and then into the bodies of 300 people at a nonprofit gala and then into a Jora Equium's memory of 1992 and then onto my office wall in a frame. It will go further than that. That is what inherited things do, when you hold them correctly and name them correctly and refuse, absolutely and with documentation, to let someone else put their grandmother's name on them. That is the whole story, every word of it is true. One more thing, I said I would say it and I will say it now. The morning after the Meridian Gala I woke up at 5:30 without an alarm. This is not unusual for me, a kitchen life is an early morning life. You wake before the city has decided what kind of day it is going to be, in the specific quiet that belongs only to that hour when the streets have not yet filled with intention. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window. The street below was the color of early light on pavement, which in Chicago in late May is a particular shade of gray-yellow that belongs to no other city and no other season. I thought about what my grandmother had said about the part of the drive through Glenwood Canyon, which is a detail that belongs to a different story and a different woman. And yet it arrived in my mind anyway, this idea that there are places that ask you to slow down, not for safety but because the place has a quality that demands attention. I think kitchens can be like that, I think certain recipes can be like that, I think Mama Chidinma's Jollof is like that. It asks you to slow down at every step, the tomatoes, the washing, the heat, the waiting, and if you rush any one of those moments you end up with something that tastes like regret. Which in the original Igbo means something more precise, but which in English is close enough. I had not rushed, that was the thing I understood standing at the window with my coffee at 5:30 on a late May morning. Through all of it, the training of Imogen and the discovery of the menu and the phone call and the folder and the cease and desist, and the Meridian kitchen and the contract and the gala. I had not rushed. I had moved at the pace the situation required, which is the pace that my grandmother had taught me without ever explicitly describing it. The pace of someone who knows that the thing they are protecting is worth taking the right amount of time to protect. I finished my coffee. I went to work. The kitchen on Randolph Street was already warm when I arrived, Kofi having come in early to start the stock. The smell of the building in the morning before the cooking has reached full volume is a specific smell that I have never been able to describe to anyone who has not worked in a kitchen. Which is the smell of potential, of everything that has ever been cooked in the space still resident in the walls and the floor and the steel, waiting for the day's additions. I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the frame. The wooden spoon was on the wall in my office. The recipe was beside it. Chidinma Okafor, Anambra State, 1994. Nadia Okafor, Randolph Street, Chicago, 2024. Kofi looked up from the stock pot. He said, "Big day?" I said, "Regular day." He nodded. He went back to the stock. I tied on my apron. I went to the back left burner. I started the tomatoes.